morning and welcome to CouncilMatters. I'm Mick Fitzgerald, and today we are delighted. We've got a first-time guest come all the way into us from Clondalkin. It's Councillor Madeleine Johansson, who represents People Before Profit Alliance out there on South Dublin Council. Madeline, welcome to CouncilMatters.
Thank you very much, Mick.
Madeline, I'm going to start off with the bio bit and say, with a name like Johansson, you probably didn't grow up in Ballymun. So what's the background to that?
No, I didn't. I'm from Sweden, so I grew up in Sweden. I lived in Sweden until I was 19, and then I came to Ireland in 2005 in the middle of the Celtic Tiger.
But Sweden is a rich country. Why would you want to?
Sure.
Were we that attractive?
Yeah. I think it was mainly because of work, to be honest. I didn't have a job. I'm from a small town in Sweden, so I didn't have a job. And there was loads of jobs in Dublin. Some of my friends were here, and they said, "Oh, come over here. There's loads of jobs. This is in the middle of the Celtic Tiger." So I did, and I was only planning to stay for 6 months, and then I'm still here.
Well, I'm going to have to say to listeners, anybody listening to Madeline, you'll understand why Sweden is classified as the country in Europe, the best country for teaching English as a second language, and you're an absolute tribute to the education system over there. You've even managed the accent, Madeline.
I'm trying my best.
So, what was your perception of Ireland? I mean, I'll tell you in a second what my perception of Sweden was, but what was your perception of Ireland before you came here?
I didn't know very much about Ireland before I came here. I obviously knew part of the history in terms of the British Empire and some of the bit about the troubles in the north, but not very much at all about the political situation or anything like that. So, when I first came here, I didn't really understand the whole political party system, how you could have two right-wing parties basically in opposition, and obviously now they're supporting one another sort of in government, but I found that very strange compared to where I come from, you know.
Yeah, well, that's probably because Sweden didn't have a civil war.
yeah, exactly.
I'm going to tell you my perception. When I was growing up in the late 60s, earlier, throughout the 70s, Sweden is the place, leaving aside the weather, we would have loved to be. You know, we always thought, that's the way you organise society, so that it's efficient, it's fair, it's a whole range of things. But if you were to say, break it all down and you say, give me Sweden in 2 words, it'd be porn and tennis players. Now, again, that's probably about as misleading of Sweden as, say, the troubles is of Ireland sort of thing. But was Sweden that great big social democratic paradise that we were led to believe?
Well, I think partially, yes. I mean, I think having grown up there, I've seen some of the benefits of the Swedish system in terms of education, healthcare, and so on. But I think a lot of that is being eroded, as it is in other countries as well at the moment. There's been a huge attack on the public services, which is a shame, but it took a lot of struggle for working class Swedish people to get those services in the first place, and I think that's the most important part, that it took struggle and fighting for people to actually get those things.
Yeah, I mean, something that always struck us, they used to always say, well, Sweden has great social services, but they're prepared to pay high taxes for it. Now, you're saying that that's under threat. Is it under threat ideologically? Because I can't believe Sweden has suddenly become more inefficient. Am I right in thinking that perhaps you've imported a few economic ideologies and that's eroding the belief in some of that?
Yeah, I mean, neoliberalism as an ideology has a strong hold over there, as it does all across the world, And I think with regards to the taxes, I think that's an interesting one, because if you actually look at the difference in Ireland, workers pay a lot of tax, whereas corporations and the rich and employers don't. Whereas in Sweden, actually, it's changed a little bit, but it used to be more so that it was the corporations and employers that paid, and the wealthy that paid a large amount of the tax. So though workers paid a share of taxes, actually, the large part of taxes came from corporations and employers.
Okay, that's interesting, because one of the issues we were always led to believe, and I don't know how true this is that there's very wealthy people in Sweden. There's no question about that. There's very wealthy families, just like there are everywhere else. But what we were always led to believe is that the wealth gap was much narrower there than it is here, whereas the wealth gap here is enormous between the really rich and the really poor people. Is that again a mythology?
No, it is partially true. Yeah, that there the wealth inequality was much lower in Sweden and still is lower in Sweden than in some other countries. Although that is partially changing as well. But that was thanks to the tax system and how you organise your tax system so that people who can afford to pay more, and particularly then an emphasis on corporations.
Okay. Again, another, and this was always something that appealed to me, is that there seemed to be less of a gap between what I would call gender rights, in the sense that Swedish women never necessarily made a big song and dance about it, but Swedish women seem to enjoy much more equality with their male counterparts than perhaps in this part of the world. Was that cultural as much as anything, or how did something like that emerge for your mother's generation, perhaps?
I think there was a huge link between actually the workers' movement and the women's movement in the 60s and 70s. Of course, there was a women's movement across the globe
Of course,
in the 60s and 70s, which obviously also took place in Sweden. And for example, abortion rights, which I will talk a little bit about later, was put in place in the 70s in Sweden through demands of women, but also there was a need for women to be in the workplace. Women workers were needed in the workplace, so therefore those services needed to be put in place so that women could actually go out and work.
Yeah. The other area where you might have found a commonality between Ireland and Sweden is in terms of military, but both countries would profess to be a neutral country in that sense. Sweden didn't partake in the Second World War. Ireland technically didn't partake. We didn't fight in the Second World War. How important is that as a, if you like, as a cultural bedrock?
I think it's been important for people in that the vast majority of people have a strong anti-war feeling, but I think profess, which was the word you just used there, is important as well, because actually if you look at the details, the same way as Ireland is now letting the US military use Shannon Airport and so on, the Swedish state often have given support or in other ways helped other countries in wars, and recently more so through arms sales, where Sweden is one of the...
Sweden was always a large arms manufacturer,
Yes,
weren't they? Bofors were...
so you could say how anti-war is it to sell arms to both sides in a war? I don't know, you know.
Well, it's that bipolarity, isn't it? You know, the government are neutral, but hold on, you know, that corporation down the road. Again, something I always was impressed with, looking at another country as to how they do it, was the emphasis that was put on two things in that sense. One was childcare and the other was education. Again, how important are they, from a personal experience, how important were they as you were growing up?
They were very important for me personally. I mean, I was in a creche or childcare.
An affordable one, probably.
Affordable one, yes. From a very, very young age. I was about 1 year when I first started, because my mum was working. So that's where I was. And I think it's important for children socially and so on to engage with other children. And you learn a lot from that experience, I think. And then, of course, for parents to be able to do it and have a choice to be able to go out and work if they want to, and have affordable childcare where they can leave their children.
So, from a philosophic or a politically philosophic point of view, are education and childcare considered to be rights of the average citizen? Because often you find, certainly when I was growing up here, you found that these were considered to be privileges rather than rights. And would that have been your experience growing up?
Yes, and now technically, I think even in law, it states that every child has a right to childcare. And to education from an early age.
I may be probably being a bit too generous here, but what struck me, just listening to you and just from my experience of observing Sweden growing up, is that if you get rid of this gender equality, it seems to me that you actually can then come in with policies that, shall we say, become equality proof in that sense of the word, and that's why I always thought Sweden was a good example of that. I'm not saying it doesn't have problems. Is that an approach you would like to see more here? Because it almost seems in this country that women have to fight for just about every inch, because somehow or other you have to establish a merit before we can actually give you any rights.
Yeah, I mean, I think you probably have to link a worker's struggle and a women's struggle or gender equality struggle together, and I think that's what happened in Sweden, and that's why those rights are so strong in Sweden, because the two were linked. And same as in Britain, if you look at Britain and
I'll come back to that one on it, because there's a very interesting point in that. Dare I say it, for all his shortcomings, and let's be honest, there are very, very many. It seems to me that Donald Trump has actually brought focus to say, hold on, we may have a woman that nobody particularly wants, but we also have a male that even less people want. In other words, what he seems to have done for me, and I'd be eternally grateful to Donald, is he's actually shown in public terms what a certain type of male thinks of women and how they behave and how they want to make policy and all of that. Do you think we've actually turned a corner in this sense of the word, that we're probably going to bury Donald in a couple of weeks' time, or Donaldness in a couple of weeks' time? Do you think we are now on the threshold of a more female era in politics? And I'm talking globally here, not necessarily in Ireland.
Well,
that's not asking you to endorse Hillary Clinton.
Yeah. I mean, that's precisely what I was going to say. Is that sure, it's possible that for some women it has become easier to become involved in politics, but then at the same time, what those women sometimes stand for and who those women are in terms of their background and so on, it's often the case that they're from very privileged backgrounds, and therefore the politics that they stand for is for the privileged, for the 1%, rather than for the vast majority of women. And I think we have a very long way to go, and particularly in Ireland, to encourage the vast majority of women to get involved in politics. It's very difficult.
Yeah. Okay, well, I again, forgive me for showing my age and all of this, because I came of age around what I would call the time of the second wave feminism. You know, if we assume the suffragettes were the first wave sort of thing, the second wave, which was the Betty Friedens, the Gloria Steinems and all of that. My other half, who would consider herself a dyed-in-the-wool feminist, has said that if you like, that wave of feminism effectively ended when women of a certain class got parity or equality with males of their own class, and they didn't really give too much of a monkeys about people of the class below them. How do you feel about that, Madeline? Yeah,
I think that's probably true. You know, I think now there's a new wave of feminism, by the way.
Well, that's what I'm hoping. Is there a new wave of feminism coming along?
I think there is. I think it's already begun. I think it's obvious in the movements that we've seen across the world. But I think there is at least some notion within that movement that class is an important issue. I mean, I think it's at least being recognised. I think probably more could be done on that, or to really put an emphasis on that and to really talk about it, because I think there's a kind of almost a fake feminism by people, the 1%, the women who are part of the 1%, the privileged part of women who basically at the moment are saying that, oh, it's all fine. We can just, if we just lean in and do our work, we can do just as well as men, whereas actually that's not the case for the vast majority of women who aren't from that kind of privileged background.
Yeah. Well, let's be open about this, and we'll talk about repealing the eighth. For those of us who were on the left a very, very long time, we always understood that terminations were always legal for women of a certain class. Drugs were always legal for people of a certain class. If you like, pedophilia was probably legal because of the way society organises itself. People in Dalkey don't get charged with possession of cocaine. It's that simple. Divorce was always legal. isn't that perhaps the issue we need to address in that sense of the word, is the hypocrisy? Because we know what goes on, but we're told it doesn't go on.
I agree, yeah, totally. I mean, particularly with regards to abortion rights and repealing the Eighth Amendment, it is the case that some women can have abortions and some can't.
Yeah.
Because they have the money to travel, they have the ability to travel, and
They have the resources to yeah.
So basically, there's some women who can have abortions and there's some who can't. And so therefore, I mean, I think it's very much an equality issue. That I actually think that the women who can afford to travel should actually have a right to have an abortion in their own country, and they shouldn't have to travel. But I think we need to recognise that it is the poor women, migrant women who can't travel, who are the most disadvantaged by the Eighth Amendment.
Okay, let me come back to that in a second, but I just want to go to economics. We've had a budget which everybody is saying, oh, it's a bit of an anodyne budget, you know, it's the way they play politics sort of thing. But at the last election, when we had Vincent Brown out in this part of the world, and they asked me to do the media piece, the point I made, and I'd be very interested to hear your view on this, Madeline, is that austerity economics disproportionately impacts women. And the point I was trying to make is that we somehow or other we should be taking this view into economic policy as well. What's your experience? Because you represent fairly much a what we would call not a disadvantaged, but not a wealthy community per se. Is that your experience out when you talk to people, when you talk to constituents, when you talk to voters, and all of that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you look at the people who are the most affected by austerity, in particular over the last number of years, it's been those working in the public sector, which is often mainly women, who are teachers, nurses, and so on. And then, of course, the people who are affected by cutbacks. There's been cuts to child benefit. There's been horrific cuts to lone parents, which hasn't been talked about as much as it should have, and highlighted as much as it should have. And then, of course, all the kind of general cuts to the community sector, where a lot of women would work as well. So I think if you look at it overall, it's very clear that women have been hit the hardest by the austerity.
Housing, how does that then impact? Are we seeing the same thing? Because that's on this program I've had various cases of people coming on, and you often find that particularly housing can be shocking impact on relationships. The same thing on employment can be. As we come to form policy and make legislation, shouldn't we be taking these things into consideration rather than just looking at the bottom line and saying, oh, we have to raise tax for this and so on, for rather than what we would call look at who are the people being impacted?
I mean, the housing crisis is impacting a huge amount of people, both women and men. For example, there's a big problem with single men who are homeless and so on, and then of course there's families that are homeless. So I think although there's added problems in terms for women in terms of being in difficult relationships and all those kind of issues, where women might have nowhere to go and so on, and then of course there's generations, like 3 generations living under the same roof in many places. A lot of overcrowding, particularly in working class areas, I know, and there's just doesn't seem to be an end to this crisis at the moment, and it's going to get worse before it gets better, I think, unfortunately.
I've spoken on this program with various colleagues, party colleagues of yours, and at the end of the day I say that what we have is we have a philosophic issue rather than necessarily a structural issue, because you could solve the housing problem if you threw money at it, there's no question about that, but that changes the market, and that's one of the problems, that the elephant in the room is actually the market. The market loves inequality because that affects prices, and in many respects isn't that the nub of the problem?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's an ideological thing. I think the government are wedded to the neoliberal ideology that says that everything has to be left up to the private market. And therefore, the only thing that they did about housing, for example, in the budget, is about more or less giving money to developers, giving tax breaks to developers, giving tax breaks to landlords, all this stuff. So it's all about trying to stimulate the private market rather than doing what they should be doing, which is building council housing, which would actually help all the aspects of the housing crisis, in terms of it would make private rents go down if there was more council housing being built, because there wouldn't be those who are on the housing list wouldn't be in the private market, and it would also then make houses cheaper to buy because there would be less pressure as well. So, but they won't do that because they are ideologically wedded to neoliberalism and to the private market.
Yeah. Do we need to perhaps then change this around? I mean, if you were to talk to particularly right-wing politicians, essentially that when they talk about housing, they're talking about assets. You know, that's what they're talking about. Oh, here you have this financial asset that's worth X amount, and accordingly I can tax that sort of thing. And I've taken this up, particularly with Labour Party councillors, and said we should be instead looking at the right to shelter. Rather than necessarily the other way around and seeing it in capitalist terms. In other words, we should be looking at the people. We should be looking at what this policy is intended to serve, rather than a greedy way of saying, oh, well, if this goes up to 500,000, we'll be able to get 5% local property tax off of it. But has that much cynicism crept into politics then, in your experience, Madeline?
Yeah, I think if you actually build council housing, for example, exactly what council housing was for was to house people who could not afford to buy their own house. That was the whole point of council housing, and that does precisely what you just said. It basically says that everyone has a right to housing and right to shelter, and I think we need to go back to talking about people's rights to housing, and the right for everyone to have a decent home, not just speak about housing as something that they can make money from, or an asset, as you say.
No, I have been very critical of the Labour Party by taxing a family home. To me, your family home is your family home. I didn't buy an asset, I bought a family home, and I'm sure that's the way you would feel about it as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I want to get on to something that's much more topical, because this very week at Dublin City Council, you raised a motion, South Dublin City Council, South Dublin County Council, about repeal the 8th. I just want to ask you about this. First of all, leaving aside the issue of what the 8th Amendment is about, Council hasn't got a competency in this area. Can a motion like that ever be anything more than symbolic, and why is it important that it should be there?
It is symbolic. It sends a message to the government, obviously, about what people feel and what they think is right, and it is mainly symbolic. It doesn't have an impact in terms of that, but it is important nevertheless, because it is important that elected representatives stand up for the people that they represent, and for their rights, which I believe this is a human right. And so for me, it is important that as elected representatives, we bring up issues, whether or not they have to do with the council or whether they're national issues, bring them up in the council, and have that democratic discussion and debate in the council.
I was before we came on, I was mentioning last week I watched a programme on RTE, which I seldom do late at night. It seemed to be a video of a radio programme, and they had 6 people on a panel, one female, which was your colleague Breed Smith, who was pretty much assailed by David Quinn from the Iona Institute. But it struck me is that in any other area that would be considered totally imbalanced, but what we have here is we have essentially 5 males, or 6 males, because the moderator was not very different. 6 males all sitting around talking about how we should regulate women's bodies. Can you imagine if that was the other way around?
Yeah, I think someone said that if priests could get pregnant, then abortion would be a sacrament. So I think it is. It was also telling in the council on Monday that the 4 members who voted against my motion were all male.
Of course.
Of
Yes,
course.
what a surprise there. What a surprise, yeah.
So it's not strange. I think that will unfortunately carry on because they claim that they need to have objectivity and so on, whereas it is nothing but partial, actually, in my opinion.
Yeah. Perhaps do we need to move the discussion around a bit, because it struck me just when I was thinking of this last night. Instead of talking about women's bodies, maybe we need to talk about male bodies. Because can you imagine if Madeleine Johansson said, we'll raise a motion at next week's City Council that anybody who's got more than 3 kids has to have a compulsory vasectomy. You'd imagine the outcry, or better still, we are going to stop now Mr. Muhammad or Mr. Moses from having their children circumcised. I mean, these are the same level, but we would dare as a society have those discussions, would we?
No, we wouldn't, and I think that's really goes to the heart of it, of what this is actually about, that it's about controlling women. It's about controlling the so-called morality of women, and the people on the other side of the debate, the anti-choicers, as I prefer to call them, their talk about their care for the unborn child and all this is actually a smokescreen for what it's really about, which is about controlling women and controlling women's lives, and particularly controlling women's sexuality.
Okay. Can I then put something into you, Madeline, because we're going to run out of time very quickly on this, is that perhaps the new feminism, which you are clearly a representative of, instead of sitting around and saying whether something is a moral issue or not a moral issue, the only issue should be that making this a matter between a woman and her GP. It should not, I should not have a say in what your fertility is, no more than you should have a say on whether I have a vasectomy or not. But that's what I'm saying, is that perhaps the avenue we need to move this debate into, is that this is not a moral issue anymore, this is purely a medical issue and a privacy issue as well.
I agree, it is an issue for a woman and her doctor, and a woman herself is the only one who should be able to make the decision for her. And I respect other people's opinions, and if they do not want to have an abortion, that is absolutely fine by me. But they should not be able to tell me or anyone else that we can't.
Yeah.
And just before we finish, can I say that there will be a bill going through the Dáil. There'll be a rally outside the Dáil on Tuesday the 25th of October at 5:30 p.m. for anyone who wants to support us.
That's next Tuesday.
Next Tuesday.
Madeline, there's some formidable women coming through South Dublin County Council. I am delighted to say we have another one here with us today. So give it up for Councillor Madeleine Johansson from Clondalkin out there. Madeline, it's been a pleasure talking to you.
Very good, thank you.
That's it for today. I want to hand over to Brian. He's done a terrific job on the desk, and of course don't go anywhere because Sean Brovey is coming up with Midweek Music Miscellany. I'm Mick Fitz, and I won't be back next week.